We're going to talk about cost estimates on page 112. We're in Walker's, we're in chapter 1. We're going to talk once again, chapter 1 does discuss scheduling and estimates and that type of thing. So there's some different types of estimates that are discussed on page 112, 113, and even when we get to page 114. So I want you to highlight budget estimate, and I want you to look at all the others there, and I want you to highlight preliminary estimate on page 113. And I want to ask you a question. What is the contingency percentage on a preliminary estimate?
10%.
It looks like it's 10%, doesn't it? But when they ask you contingency percentage, always look at the end of the paragraph. That's where you're going to find contingency percentage. So the contingency percentage for preliminary is 25%. Same thing with design review and so forth. All those different estimates, if you're asked contingency percentage, you go to the end of the paragraph and answer there. And you might get something called a budget cost estimate. They could call it a pre-design cost estimate, because these are types of cost estimates. So if some people do use those terms as well. I hope that made sense to you. Let's go to page 124 and 125. We're talking about job overhead here. And once again, it's an estimating book, and some of this information doesn't really seem to fit here, but it's in here, and everything that's in this book is fair game for the test, so I want to make sure that we cover this. On page 124, there's a discussion of job overhead, plant, and equipment. As we go to page 125, I want you to drop down about halfway down the page, just a little more than halfway down the page actually, and highlight this paragraph. If the contractor does elect to purchase equipment, he should set up a separate records for each item. Be sure to consider the Internal Revenue Service's depreciation schedule allowed, the probable life, the probable maintenance and storage cost, the actual cost of transporting the item from job to job, and the cost of operating the equipment on the job. Now here's what's really key in this paragraph. Enter an hourly rate chargeable for the use of the item on each job estimate. You want to do that for sure. As we go to page 126 at the bottom and on to page 127, we're talking about, or Walker's is discussing, bonds. If we go a little more than halfway down on page 127 in bold print, there is a discussion of performance and payment bonds. Some owners and most public works require that each contractor to whom a contract is awarded shall furnish bonds which contain two obligations: a performance bond, which indemnifies the owner against loss resulting from the failure of the contractor to complete the work in accordance with the plans and specifications. Once again, it's very important for you to read this and answer questions word for word. On page 128, I want to discuss about halfway down the page something that's in bold print called a license or a permit bond. What in the world are these? Well, these are bonds provided by a contractor to a public body guaranteeing compliance with local codes and ordinances. If the contractor regularly operates in an area requiring such bonds, this cost should be carried under office overhead. So that's one way. If he regularly has to require these bonds, be required to have these bonds, it's office overhead. It's a normal cost of doing business. But if it is required for a specific job, it can be charged directly as a job expense. So make sure that you understand that distinction. You may want to read that a couple of times. Let's go to page 1-30, that's not 1-, just 133 at the bottom. The last paragraph says there are two common builder's risk forms that may be written. Your builder's risk reporting form. This form affords coverage for the contractor from the time the material is placed on the job site until the building is completed. Under this form, the contractor reports to the insurance company the actual value of the building at the end of each month as construction progresses, and pays a premium each month on the additional values that go into the building. On the top of page 134, there's a completed value builder's risk form, which is normally preferred by the contractor because it gives 100% coverage without the necessity of keeping records as to the value of the building as it progresses, or reporting at the end of each month. On page 135, there's a discussion of profit, and we're going to go to the second paragraph on profit. On small jobs, alterations, remodeling, and similar work, a contractor is justified in adding 20 to 30% profit to the actual cost. But he must ask himself whether he can actually obtain this amount. On new work, where it is possible to estimate cost with a fair degree of accuracy, a contractor is entitled to 10 to 15% on the actual cost of the work. So, make sure you can find that. I know that we are in a different economic environment nowadays, and that may not be true, but if we get somebody asks us a question about that, we're going to answer the way Walker tells us to. Let's go to page 142. Once again, as I discussed before, Walker's chapter 1 discusses scheduling. And there are some different methods and different tools with regard to scheduling on page 142 that is discussed in this chapter. Under scheduling, let's go to the second paragraph. The CPM, the critical path method for project scheduling, began in the 1950s in two parallel applications. The U.S. Navy developed PERT, Project Evaluation and Review Technique, to develop a schedule for the construction of the Polaris program. This technique used probabilistic durations for activities. At the same time, DuPont was developing the critical path method for its construction projects. The CPM used deterministic duration for activities. The CPM became the most common tool for scheduling construction activities. Now, over the next couple of pages, it tells you actually how to set up a critical path method. We don't really have to be concerned with this, but as we flip to page 144 and 145, we need to understand the different terms. On page 144 at the bottom, you have something called an early start. Okay? Make sure you can find what they're talking about. Early finish is on the top of page 145. You have late finish, late start, finish to start, start to start, finish to finish, and a network logic diagram. Make sure that you can find all those definitions that refer to the critical path method and scheduling. There are more things on page 146 and 147. Make sure that you can find forward pass about halfway down the page on page 146. You have a backwards pass on page 147 and a total float on that page as well. The second paragraph under total float calculations says the total float is the amount of time an activity can be delayed without delaying the end of the project. That's one that I want you to make sure you have highlighted. As we flip over to page 150 and 151, we're talking about updating our schedule. And I want you to find on page 150, actually, let's back up just a little bit. Back up to page 148. At the bottom of page 148, there's a discussion of monitoring and updating. This is the last paragraph. Once the project schedule is completed and agreed on, this schedule becomes the baseline schedule against which all progress will be measured. The baseline schedule is frozen and saved, and a copy of the baseline would be used for monitoring and updating. So that baseline schedule is frozen and saved. Make sure you can relate to that. Now we go to page 151. We drop down to the second to the last paragraph, and it says in bold print, critical path analysis. The critical path was defined earlier as activities with zero float. Activities with zero float is a critical path. Those are the activities which have to happen. They have to start on time and finish on time in order for the project to get to be completed on time. Let's look on page 155. There's some interesting information from this point to the rest of the end of the chapter, which at first I found it confusing as to why it would be in this chapter. We're talking about scheduling, we're talking about bonds, we're talking about other types of estimate, we're talking about loans, we're talking about the AIA documents. All of a sudden, we're talking on the top of page 155, we're reading about a laborer. The second line, a laborer is generally rated as being able to handle a maximum of 100 pounds. Well, why is that here in this chapter? Well, the only thing I can figure is if you're going to be doing an estimating on a job, it'd be a good idea to know how much a laborer can handle, because if it's too much for a laborer, well, then you're going to have to get some equipment, and then you're going to have to estimate the equipment. So that's why it would be here. Same thing on page 158. There's a discussion of scaffolding here. You have tubular steel scaffolding there on page 158. As you go to page 159 at the bottom, there's suspended scaffolding. Why are we talking about scaffolding? Well, if you're going to do a job, you better know a little bit about scaffolding, especially if it's a big job and how much it's going to cost. So under suspended scaffolding at the bottom of page 159, we're told that the most economical method of scaffolding for masonry work on buildings with a structural steel or reinforced concrete skeleton framework is suspended scaffolding. There we go, suspended scaffolding. So make sure you can find that. That's going to take us all the way through chapter 1, and hopefully you'll get a good idea. Now you have a good idea of the kind of things that are in chapter 1 in Walker's. Once again, if you have the time, I recommend that you sit down with Walker's, go page by page, read all of chapter 1, because I can tell you, at some point in the future, you're liable to run into somebody that's going to ask you a lot of questions about chapter 1 out of Walker's. It might be at a dinner party, it might be on a job site, or it might be while you're taking a test somewhere. Okay? There you go. That's chapter 1 Walker.